The bar was a place built from the dregs of better things. It called itself the Anchor and Chain, a name as uninspired as the watered-down whiskey it served. The air inside was a thick, layered thing, a permanent tapestry woven from the ghosts of 1,000 cheap cigars, the sharp tang of spilled beer that had become one with the warped wooden floor, and the cloying sweetness of industrial-grade cleaner failing to conquer the grime. Over it all lay the scent of the sea, not the clean, bracing salt of the open ocean, but the harbor's breath. A heavy mix of diesel fumes, dead brine, and the metallic grit of the sprawling naval shipyard next door. The sounds were just as layered. A low, electric hum from the ancient neon sign that flickered more than it glowed. The rhythmic, mournful clang of a loose halyard against a steel mast carried on the wind, and the groaning protest of the building itself as it settled deeper into the damp soil of the pier. It was a place of perpetual twilight, where the only sources of light were the jaundiced glow of the bar lamps and the hypnotic, colorful dance of a jukebox that seemed to play only songs about leaving, losing, or dying. This was not a place for celebration. It was a holding pen for men and women waiting for their next deployment, their next drink, or the end of their shift. It was a purgatory of formica and regret, and it was precisely where the universe had chosen to stage its lesson. In the darkest corner of this dim establishment, at a small table that wobbled if you looked at it too hard, sat a woman who was the antithesis of her surroundings. She was a study in stillness, a pocket of calm in the low-grade chaos of the bar. She was not beautiful in the way a magazine cover is beautiful, nor was she plain. She was simply present, yet utterly unobtrusive. Her presence was like a single, perfectly written line of code in a program full of errors. It did its job so efficiently it was almost invisible. She wore a plain gray hoodie, the fabric soft and worn from countless washes, a pair of nondescript jeans, and sturdy boots that had seen more miles than the rusted pickup parked outside. Her hair was pulled back in a simple, functional knot, and her face, devoid of makeup, was one of quiet intelligence. Before her, on the sticky surface of the table, sat a glass of water and a thick, academic-looking textbook on advanced fluid dynamics. She read with a placid intensity, her eyes tracing the complex equations as if they were simple prose, her focus an impenetrable shield against the noise and the gloom. She turned a page with a quiet, economical movement, a motion so devoid of wasted energy it was almost unnerving. She was a lioness allowing a pack of jackals to dance and snarl at the very edge of its kill radius, utterly unconcerned, aware of their presence but assigning it no value. She was waiting, and she was a master of waiting. The jackals, in this particular instance, were holding court at the bar. The Alpha was Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne, United States Marine Corps. He was a large man, not with the soft bulk of inactivity, but with the hard, dense muscle forged in gyms and on forced marches. His uniform was a declaration of war on mediocrity. The creases in his trousers were sharp enough to cut. The shine on his boots reflected the bar's dim lights with a defiant glare, and the ribbons on his chest told a story of places he had been and things he had done. His face looked as if it had been carved from naval tradition itself. A strong jaw, a rigid posture, eyes that were constantly scanning, assessing, and judging. Authority radiated from him like heat from a furnace, a palpable force that bent the atmosphere of the bar around him. He was flanked by two younger Marines, a Corporal Diaz and a Lance Corporal Smith, both of whom orbited him with the nervous energy of acolytes, laughing a little too loudly at his jokes and nodding a little too vigorously at his pronouncements. Thorne was the king of this small, sticky kingdom, a domain where his rank and his voice were the only laws that mattered. Yet, for all his bluster, a careful observer, an observer like the woman in the corner, could see the subtle flicker of insecurity in his eyes, the constant need for validation that fueled his domineering presence. His confidence was a performance, a carefully constructed edifice built on the deference of others. The evening wore on, the clock on the wall bleeding minutes into the smoky air. Thorn, his thirst for beer matched only by his thirst for an audience, was growing bored. The usual stories had been told, the usual boasts had been made. His gaze swept the room, a predator looking for a new form of sport, and it landed inevitably on the woman in the corner. He saw not a person, but a collection of assumptions. He saw a civilian in a military bar, an intrusion. He saw a woman alone, a vulnerability. He saw a bookish academic, a weakness. In his rigidly defined world of hierarchies and uniforms, she was an anomaly, an error in the system that needed to be corrected, or at least publicly identified and mocked. He nudged Corporal Diaz with his elbow. "Look at that," he said, his voice a low rumble of contempt. "Probably some pencil pusher from the Admiral's staff thinks she can hang with the big boys." His cronies snickered, the sound thin and sycophantic. Thorn drained the last of his beer, slammed the heavy glass mug on the bar with a definitive crack, and pushed himself to his feet. The performance was about to begin. He moved toward her table with the rolling gait of a man who owned every floor he walked on. His shadow fell over her book long before he arrived. He stood there for a moment, waiting to be acknowledged, but she did not look up. The page held her complete attention. This was his first miscalculation. He had expected her to be intimidated by his mere proximity. He cleared his throat, a sound like gravel being ground under a boot. Nothing. The quiet defiance of her focus was a greater insult than any spoken word could have been. "Hey," he began, his voice laced with a condescending familiarity that set teeth on edge throughout the suddenly quiet bar. "You're in the wrong place, sweetheart. This is a private party. For professionals." He gestured vaguely at the room full of uniforms, defining his world and casting her out of it in a single arrogant motion. His two followers had drifted behind him, forming a small, intimidating semicircle around her table, slowly, as if returning from a great distance. The woman lifted her head. Her eyes, a cool and analytical gray, met his. There was no fear in them. There was no anger. There was not even annoyance. There was only a calm, dispassionate assessment, the look a geologist might give a common rock. "I'm waiting for a transport," she said. Her voice was even, pitched just loud enough to be heard clearly, a simple statement of fact. It carried no emotional weight, no plea for understanding, no hint of apology. It was the verbal equivalent of a brick wall. It did not argue, it simply was. This response was Thorn's second, and far more critical, miscalculation. He was a creature of emotion and dominance. He understood anger, which he could meet with greater anger. He understood fear, which fed his ego. He did not understand this placid, unassailable calm. It was like punching water. It infuriated him because it gave him no purchase, no leverage. It denied him the reaction he craved, the reaction his entire sense of self was built upon. "Transport?" he scoffed, his voice rising in volume, drawing the attention of every patron in the bar. "What kind of transport are you waiting for, little lady? The bus back to the library?" The two Marines behind him chuckled dutifully. He leaned forward, placing his big, scarred hands flat on her small table, invading her personal space, a classic maneuver of physical intimidation. "I don't think you heard me. I said, you're in the wrong place. This is a warrior's bar. We don't have much use for whatever it is you do." He flicked a disdainful finger at her textbook, his nail making a sharp, clicking sound against the hardcover. He was trying to provoke her, to force her onto his battlefield of loud words and raw emotion. He needed her to yell, to cry, to shrink away. He needed to see her break. She did not break. Her gaze did not waver from his face. She held his stare for a long, silent moment, a moment that stretched until it became uncomfortable for everyone watching. Then she blinked once, a slow, deliberate motion. "Your assumption is noted," she said, her voice still impossibly level. And then she did the most infuriating thing of all. She lowered her eyes and returned to her book, dismissing him as completely as one might dismiss a fly. The dismissal was so total, so absolute, it was a physical blow. It declared him irrelevant. And for a man like Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne, irrelevance was a fate worse than death. A dark, ugly flush crept up Thorne's thick neck. The quiet snickers from the bar died away, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. This was no longer sport. It was a battle of wills, and he was losing. With a roar of pure frustration, he swept his arm across the table. The heavy textbook flew through the air, its pages fluttering like a wounded bird before it crashed against the far wall. Her glass of water tipped over, its contents spreading in a slow, dark stain across the scarred wood. "You look at me when I'm talking to you," he bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. The sound echoed in the shocked silence. His chest was heaving. He had finally resorted to physical violence, the last refuge of a man who had lost the argument. He stood there, panting, a triumphant, ugly sneer on his face, waiting for the tears, for the fear he had finally earned. But the woman did not cry. She did not flinch. She did not even seem surprised. She slowly, deliberately, slid her chair back. She bent down, her movements still economical and precise, and retrieved her book from the floor where it lay splayed open. She brushed a speck of dust from its cover. Then she returned to the table, took a clean napkin from the dispenser, and calmly began to blot up the spilled water. She did all of this without once looking at him, without acknowledging his outburst in any way. Her control was a tangible thing, a force field he could not breach. She was a master of a discipline he could not comprehend, and her refusal to engage on his terms was a more profound defeat than any physical retaliation could ever be. He stood over her, a monument to impotent rage, his victory tasting like ash in his mouth. The bar held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. What happened next came not from within the bar, but from without. It began as a low, guttural groan, a sound that seemed to rise from the very pilings of the pier, a vibration felt more in the bones than in the ears. It was followed by the horrifying, drawn-out shriek of tortured metal, a sound of immense scale, like a giant tearing a battleship in half. The lights in the anchor and chain flickered violently, then died, plunging the room into absolute blackness for a terrifying second before the emergency strobes kicked in, bathing everything in a pulsating, hellish red light. The entire building shuddered, a violent tremor that sent glasses crashing from the bar and knocked men from their stools. A collective cry of alarm and confusion rose from the patrons. The personal, petty drama at the corner table was instantly obliterated, swallowed whole by a crisis of unimaginable proportions. The doors of the bar burst open as panicked men and women, their faces stark and pale in the strobing red light, scrambled outside to see what had happened. Thorne, his rage forgotten, was swept along with them, his training kicking in. He was a Marine. Chaos was his business. He shoved his way through the crowd and onto the pier, his mind already cycling through emergency protocols. But what he saw stopped him cold, erasing all training, all procedure from his mind. The scene before him was apocalyptic. The USS Vindicator, a guided missile frigate that had been sitting in the massive dry dock number 3 for a refit, was in catastrophic trouble. One of the colossal keel blocks, supporting its thousands of tons of dead weight, had failed. The ship was listing, tilted at a sickening, unnatural angle, its bow slipping off the supports. Every groan of its hull was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. Sparks rained down from severed power lines, and the air was thick with the smell of ozone and hot metal. A chain reaction was not just possible, it was imminent. If the ship's hull breached, its fuel and ordnance would go up, taking half the shipyard and a good portion of the base with it. Panic was the order of the moment. Shipyard workers were running, shouting, their voices thin and lost in the cacophony of blaring alarms and the groaning of the dying ship. Sailors were pointing, their faces masks of disbelief and terror. The established authorities, the officers and senior enlisted who were supposed to be in charge, were just as lost. A portly lieutenant commander was screaming into a radio, his voice a high-pitched squeal of panic, relaying information that was already 5 minutes out of date. Thorne and his 2 Marines instinctively tried to impose order. "Form a perimeter," Thorne yelled, his voice sounding ridiculously small against the backdrop of the disaster. "Secure the area? Diaz, Smith, with me? We need crowd control." They were following the textbook, applying a solution for a riot or a security breach to a complex engineering disaster. They were shouting orders that had no relevance, attempting to control a situation that was utterly beyond their comprehension. Their authority, so absolute and suffocating inside the bar just minutes before, had evaporated into the night air. They were just 3 more men, shouting uselessly into a hurricane. And then, through the chaos, she moved. The woman from the bar, the quiet academic, emerged onto the pier. But it was not the same woman. The placid observer was gone, stripped away like a disguise. In her place was something else entirely, something focused and ferociously alive. Her previous stillness had been a state of readiness, a coiled spring, and the crisis had just released the catch. She did not run. She moved with a fluid, predatory purpose, her gray eyes sweeping across the scene, not with panic, but with an intense, rapid-fire analysis. She was not seeing a disaster. She was seeing a complex, multivariable problem, and her mind was already breaking it down, calculating vectors, stress loads, and failure points. The chaos did not confuse her. It was her native element. The noise, the lights, the fear, they were just data points to be processed. She saw a shore patrolman standing frozen near the gangway, his radio clutched in his hand like a talisman, his face slack with shock. She moved toward him, not asking, not requesting. She simply took the radio from his unresisting hand. She keyed the microphone, and when she spoke, her voice was unrecognizable. The quiet, even tone was gone, replaced by a voice of pure, unadulterated command. It was not loud, but it possessed a quality of absolute authority that cut through the surrounding noise like a laser. "All stations, this is override command," she said, her voice a sharp, clear signal in the storm of static and panic. "Cease all current comms. Acknowledge." There was a moment of stunned silence on the net. Then a hesitant series of clicks as operators, trained to recognize true command presence, instinctively obeyed. What followed was a symphony of technical mastery that silenced everyone within earshot. Engineering? I need immediate status on ballast pumps 2, 4, and 7. I want a real-time report on list and trim, updated every 15 seconds. Damage control, get me a pressure reading on hull plates C7 through F12 now. Crane operations. What's the max load and current extension of heavy cranes 1 and 3? Do not move them. I repeat, do not move them until I give the order. I need the precise sequence for a counterballast flood to starboard tanks, factoring for a 20-degree list and a compromised port-side keel support. The stream of orders was relentless, a torrent of complex jargon and precise technical imperatives. It was a foreign language of expertise, a language that spoke of an intimate, profound understanding of naval architecture, stress dynamics, and crisis management. She was not guessing. She was calculating. She was not hoping. She was directing. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The panicked, disparate groups of workers and sailors suddenly had a focal point, a center of gravity in the swirling chaos. Her certainty was an anchor. People stopped running and started listening. A grizzled chief engineer, his face covered in grease and fear, heard her transmission over a nearby loudspeaker. His eyes went wide. He grabbed his own radio. "Override command, this is engineering. We're on it." A young ensign from damage control, who had been about to order a fatal, incorrect procedure, froze and relayed her orders to his team instead. She was conducting an orchestra of salvation, using nothing but her voice, her knowledge, and the sheer, undeniable force of her competence. She took control of the situation, not by demanding it, but by demonstrating a level of mastery that made any other course of action unthinkable. Thorne and his Marines could only stand and watch, their mouths hanging open, their own shouts about perimeters and crowd control dying on their lips. They were utterly, completely useless. They were soldiers on a battlefield that required engineers, warriors in a world that demanded a physicist. Thorne watched the woman in the gray hoodie, the pencil pusher he had humiliated, orchestrate the single most complex and effective emergency response he had ever witnessed. She was a general, and this chaotic pier was her war room. He did not understand the words she was saying. Isostatic equilibrium, torsional stress, hydraulic shear, but he understood their effect. He saw lights flicker on in strategic parts of the damaged dry dock. He heard the deep, powerful thrum of massive pumps kicking into life in a precise, calculated sequence. He saw the slow, almost imperceptible shift as the great ship began to stabilize, its groans lessening as the countermeasures she directed took hold. The dawning comprehension hit him not as a thought, but as a cold, heavy certainty in the pit of his stomach. This woman was not just competent. She was not just smart. She was operating on a plane of existence so far beyond his own that he could not even see the edges of it. He had not picked a fight with a librarian. He had picked a fight with a god. Just as the situation began to transition from imminent catastrophe to a tense but manageable crisis, the thumping beat of rotor blades cut through the air. A Navy Seahawk helicopter descended from the dark sky, its searchlight carving a brilliant white circle on the pier. It landed in a cleared area with practiced ease, and from its side door emerged a figure who radiated an authority even greater than Thorne's. It was Rear Admiral Callahan, the base commander, a man whose stern, weathered face had graced the covers of naval journals and whose reputation was legendary. He was a man who had commanded carrier strike groups, a man who answered only to the Pentagon. He strode from the helicopter into the controlled chaos, his face a mask of grim, professional concern, his eyes taking in the entire scene in a single, sweeping glance. Callahan's gaze passed over the shouting foreman, the saluting junior officers, and the scurrying damage control teams. He was looking for the center, for the person in command. His eyes found her. He saw the small woman in the gray hoodie, the radio held to her ear, her other hand gesturing with sharp, precise movements as she directed a crane operator. He saw her, and the grim mask on his face dissolved, replaced by an expression of profound, almost stunned, relief. He did not shout her name. He did not rush to her side. He turned to his terrified-looking aide, a young lieutenant who was struggling to keep up. "Get a secure SAT link to SOCOM command right now." The Admiral's voice was a low, urgent bark. Tell them Sea Dragon is on site and has assumed operational control of the Vindicator incident." He then turned and walked directly toward her, his steps purposeful and sure. The name hung in the air, meaningless to most, but for a few old hands, a master chief in a nearby fire crew, a senior warrant officer from the shipyard, it landed like a physical blow. Their heads snapped up, their eyes wide with disbelief. Sea Dragon. It was a whisper, a myth. Thorne saw their reactions, the shock and awe on the faces of men he knew to be unflappable, and his confusion deepened into a cold dread. Admiral Callahan did not stop until he was a few feet from her. The woman, Reed, finished her transmission, then turned to face him, her expression calm, as if she were merely greeting a colleague. But Callahan did not offer a handshake. He stopped, drew himself up to his full height, and his voice boomed across the pier, a formal parade ground command that cut through every other sound. "Attention on deck!" He then executed the sharpest, most impeccably rigid salute Thorne had ever seen in his life. It was not the perfunctory salute an admiral gives a subordinate. It was a gesture of profound, almost reverent respect, a public acknowledgement of a higher authority. A two-star admiral saluting a woman in a hoodie. The scene was so stunning, so utterly contrary to the established order of the military universe, that for a moment the entire pier fell silent. The only sounds were the hum of the pumps and the distant clang of metal. And into that silence, the narrator of this history must step in to provide the context that shattered Gunnery Sergeant Thorne's world forever. The woman was Commander Dr. Evelyn Reed, United States Navy. The title of doctor was not honorary. She held PhDs in both naval engineering and applied physics from MIT. The title of commander was almost a footnote. Her real career had been spent not in the conventional fleet, but in the shadowy, ultra-elite world of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. She was a Tier 1 operator, but her weapon was not a rifle. It was her mind. She was the one they called when SEAL teams faced an impossible engineering problem behind enemy lines, when a captured submarine needed to be reverse-engineered overnight, when a nuclear reactor on a carrier threatened to melt down. Sea Dragon was her call sign, a name spoken with a mixture of awe and fear in the highest echelons of SOCOM and the intelligence community. She had more confirmed saves than most snipers had kills. Entire fleets, bases, and operations pulled back from the brink of disaster by her intellect alone. The medals she was authorized to wear would have covered the front of her uniform, but they were all classified, so she wore none. She was a living legend who had chosen a life of anonymity, and Marcus Thorne had just tried to bully her over a spilled drink. The truth did not just dawn on him, it detonated in his mind, leveling the entire structure of his reality. Hours later, the immediate danger had passed. The USS Vindicator was stable, held in a precarious but secure cradle of carefully balanced floodwaters and crane cables. The pier was a landscape of exhaustion, littered with equipment and weary figures in stained coveralls. Commander Reed stood near the gangway, sipping a cup of coffee someone had handed her, looking once more like the unassuming academic from the bar. Thorne was sitting on a wooden crate nearby, a shrunken figure, the arrogant gunny replaced by a hollowed-out man staring at the deck. The bravado had been stripped from him, leaving only the raw, exposed core of his colossal error. Reed walked over to him. He flinched as her shadow fell over him, expecting a tirade, a dressing down that would end his career. But Reed's voice when she spoke was not angry. It was cool, clinical, and utterly devastating. It was the voice of a professor conducting an after-action review. "Gunnery Sergeant," she began, and he visibly tensed at the formal address. "Let's analyze your tactical performance this evening." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Your primary failure was not rudeness. That was merely a symptom. Your critical error was a complete failure of intelligence gathering and threat assessment. You made a definitive operational decision based on catastrophically flawed and incomplete data. You assessed my gender, my clothing, and my choice of reading material as definitive indicators of my capabilities. You saw what you expected to see, not what was actually there." She took a sip of her coffee. "In a bar, that mistake is an embarrassment. In my line of work, that mistake creates a wall of names in Langley or a new row of headstones at Arlington. Your prejudice is not a personal failing, Gunnery Sergeant. It is a tactical vulnerability. A fatal one." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Every precisely chosen word was a hammer blow, deconstructing his arrogance and reframing it as what it truly was, a professional incompetence of the highest order. Just then, Admiral Callahan approached, his face set like granite. He looked at Thorne with eyes like ice chips. "Gunnery Sergeant Thorne," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You're relieved of your duties. Report to my aide at 0600. We'll discuss the future of your career then." Thorne just nodded, his head bowed. He was finished. A public altercation with a civilian was bad enough. A public altercation with a living legend like Commander Reed was career suicide. He was already picturing the court-martial, the disgrace, but then Reed held up a hand. "With all due respect, Admiral," she said, turning to Callahan, "I have a different recommendation." The Admiral raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "The Marine Corps doesn't need one less gunnery sergeant," she continued, her eyes still on the broken man on the crate. "It needs better ones. Ones who understand that the most dangerous weapon on any battlefield is the one you underestimate. I am being reassigned to a special projects team at the Pentagon next month. I request that Gunnery Sergeant Thorne be assigned as my inter-service liaison." Callahan stared at her, then at Thorne, a slow understanding dawning on his face. Thorne looked up, his expression one of utter shock. It was a fate he could never have imagined. It was not a punishment of demotion or confinement. It was a sentence of education. He would be forced to work, day in and day out, for the very person he had so profoundly misjudged. He would have a front-row seat to her brilliance, her discipline, her quiet, terrifying competence. He would be forced to confront his own ignorance every single morning when he reported for duty. It was a subtle, brilliant, and far more transformative punishment than any the uniform code of military justice could devise. Reed had decided not to break him, but to rebuild him. Callahan considered it for a long moment. Then a slow, thin smile touched his lips. "Consider it done, Commander," he said. His education begins at 0600. The story of that night passed into the annals of base lore. It became a modern fable, a teaching tool whispered in hushed, reverent tones. They called it the night the dragon woke. With each telling, the details grew more grand, the ship's list more severe, Thorne's insults more outrageous, and Commander Reed's commands more brilliant. But the core of the story, the essential truth of it, remained unchanged. It became a cautionary tale for every arrogant NCO and every cocky junior officer who thought they understood the shape of the world. It was a reminder that the most unassuming person in the room might be the most dangerous, that true strength rarely needs to advertise, and that judgment based on appearance is a fool's game. The legend of Commander Reed became a permanent part of the institutional culture, a ghost of competence that haunted every dockside bar and every ready room. 5 years later, at the Marine Corps' Advanced Leadership School at Quantico, a class of newly promoted staff sergeants sat listening to their instructor. The instructor was Master Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne. He was a different man. The loud, swaggering bully was gone, replaced by a quiet, thoughtful leader who commanded respect not through volume, but through a deep, hard-won wisdom. His voice was calm, his eyes steady, and he carried himself with a humility that was far more imposing than his previous arrogance had ever been. He was telling a story to the young, sharp-faced Marines in front of him, the future leaders of the Corps. "Let me tell you about the biggest mistake of my career," he began, and he told them the story of the anchor and chain. He spared no detail of his own ignorance, his own prejudice, his own spectacular failure. He painted himself as the villain, the fool, the perfect example of what not to be. "She never raised her voice," he told them, his own voice quiet with the memory. "She never had to. Her competence was her weapon. Her actions were her argument. She taught me that the person you dismiss is the person who holds the knowledge you need. She taught me that respect is not about demanding it. It's about recognizing it in others, especially where you least expect it." He had become the most effective instructor at the academy, precisely because his greatest lesson was his own humiliation. He had been transformed, reforged in the fire of his own failure by the woman he had wronged. And so the lesson rippled outward, carried by the men and women who heard the tale, a story not just of military life, but of a universal truth. It served as a powerful, enduring testament to a simple, profound moral. True strength is not loud. It is quiet, efficient, and devastatingly effective. True authority is not seized. It is earned through undeniable competence. The world is full of assumptions, of cheap, easy judgments based on the uniforms people wear, or the way they look or the books they read. But substance will always, eventually, triumph over style. The most dangerous people in the world are not the ones who tell you how dangerous they are. They are the quiet professionals, the hidden masters, the unassuming experts who sit silently in the corner, waiting. They are not waiting for a fight. They are waiting for a problem to solve. And when the crisis comes, when the noise and the panic and the shouting have failed, they will stand up, and with a quiet word and a simple, decisive action, they will save the world, leaving the arrogant and the ignorant to stand by and watch in silent, humbled awe. Let your actions be your argument. Let your competence be your creed. For in the end, that is the only voice the world truly respects.